So I will tell you that when I put that in Waze to get here, it said 603 miles, which I said, wow, Nonantum's pretty far away. But it was actually for a place in Ontario. So it's, according to Waze, the closest one is Ontario. So I do want to announce that Julia is live recording.
Live
this
streaming
tonight.
on YouTube Live, so anyone can see it later.
Okay, so fantastic. Great. So I'm going to introduce my staff that are here, that are in the back. We're going to be around even after the formal presentation to answer questions. We're going to throw a lot of information at you tonight, a lot of technical terms. So we want to be here to answer whatever questions we can. And that's really what this is designed to do tonight, is to give you an introduction to zoning and try to answer questions that are on your mind. I do want to say at the outset, this isn't designed to be anxiety producing. So I know when you start talking about your neighborhood and your street and your house, it's really important to you, and we totally get that. We just want to emphasize tonight is the dialogue, really, so we can hear from you what your concerns are, what you don't understand. We're at an early stage of this. This is the very initial draft. We don't expect it to be perfect. That's why we're doing this in all 8 wards, and why we're holding office hours, and why we meet at ZAP on a regular basis. To improve on it and to make it perfect, or as perfect as it can be. So with that, let me introduce the staff in the back, and then I'll introduce James and Rachel. So if you guys could just raise your hands, Shubi and Janet and Noreen. It's a team effort here. There's snacks and water in the back. There's a bathroom through that door to the right. So we're going to give a brief presentation. Then we're going to answer some questions, I think, from the audience. And then, as I said, we'll be around afterwards to walk through the map or any questions that you have. So I'm going to introduce James Fries and Rachel Ned Carney, who have done the bulk of the work on the zoning ordinance, to give you the presentation tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Barney. I guess brief presentation is a subjective term, but it's not terribly long. So, as has been stated, we're here to talk about the first draft of Newton's zoning ordinance. Overall agenda for tonight: start with our objective, dig in a little bit into the background of the project, talk a little bit about reading the first draft ordinance, the map, and then we'll do some talk about some of the key features of the ordinance. So our objective for tonight, we want to provide really what is an overview and an orientation to this first draft of the ordinance. And I'm emphasizing the terms first draft heavily. There's a lot of work that's gone into this already, but there is going to be a lot more. And we see this as the start of a conversation. One that's going to stretch over many months with the city council and with the public at large. So I'm emphasizing first draft and the start of a conversation. Background, just to get everybody up to speed. We don't all start in the same place. What is zoning? So zoning is the regulation of our built environment. The types of buildings, the uses that go in those buildings, how they're located on different lots, and how they relate to the street and the buildings around them. How does zoning get set? Who does this? So our city council actually is the adopting body. Zoning, like any other body of regulation, is a legislative action, and our city council is our legislative body. Our role as city staff is to support city council in putting together this work, doing the research, doing the drafting, but most importantly, working with the city council to listen to the community, get feedback on this work, and produce draft ordinance language. So what are the central elements of zoning? First and foremost, we have a zoning map, divides the city up into zoning districts, residential districts, commercial districts, so on. And then those districts are further defined within the text of the zoning ordinance. That's where you find the rules. Amongst those rules are dimensional requirements, things like the height, the bulk of buildings. There are development and use standards that apply to how buildings are built, what they have to do relative to a piece of property. And then there's a decision-making process whereby discretionary decisions within the zoning ordinance are made, around special permits, variances, how things actually go from an idea to construction, whether that development entails adding a front porch to somebody's home or a large building. So Newton actually has a very long history with zoning. We're one of the early adopters of zoning as an idea. Zoning came into the country in 1916 in New York City. And we, right on the heels of that release, came in and adopted zoning ordinance in 1922. In 1941, we actually then started introducing the idea of minimum lot sizes, setbacks, and those types of ideas. And then in 1953, we went and increased all of those. The last major look at the zoning ordinance was in 1987, where there was some reorganization and some updates to the commercial zone. But fundamentally, our zoning ordinance is still a 1941, 1953 product. 2011 really kicks off this process of what has been called zoning reform, and now we refer to as the Zoning Redesign project. 2011, the City Council and the Mayor created the Zoning Reform Group, which really laid out our marching orders for completing this project. In 2015, the first phase of that project was completed, which was a reorganization and modernization of the ordinance itself without really any changes to the content. In 2016 and 2017, we began work on what I'm going to refer to it as our pattern book, and then in 2017 we did a series of events on various topics related to zoning ordinance. And then, as was mentioned before, on October 22nd, we released the first draft of this work. So there's a lot of different ideas that came through in the 2011 zoning reform report about what the objectives were in this project. I'm not going to read all of these, but to really sum them up, what the City Council was asking us to do was create a zoning ordinance that preserves and enhances what we love about Newton, while modernizing and advancing the issues we care about, like addressing climate change and ensuring housing diversity. So staff took these set of marching orders, if you will, and we came up with the idea of doing what we're calling a context-based zoning ordinance, where the rules are derived from the existing or desired context, where that desired context has been defined. So overwhelmingly, what we used was the existing context of the city, the existing buildings, lots, etc. So there were three primary reasons that we took this approach. One of those was simply a recognition of the existing quality of place. One cannot go far without hearing people who talk about how great Newton is as a community already today, the villages, the neighborhoods, etc. And so to us, that seemed like a good place to start when thinking about what the rules should be for development. Second was the sustainability, the environmental sustainability of this form of development. In fact, the village center, walkable village centers around transit, neighborhoods adjacent to those, this is actually what many communities today now aspire to in terms of environmental sustainability in the form of development. For us, it's already here in large part, and so we can draw on that in developing the rules. And then finally was the idea of future planning, the understanding that this ordinance, when it is adopted, is not going to be Newton's final zoning ordinance, and that there's going to continue to be future planning work, and where there's the objective or the idea that we should be considering dramatic changes to the city, or even subtle changes in the city, that should be the product of planning work where we have an opportunity to do the in-depth analysis that's necessary for that. And then zoning should come from that future work. So the first step, if one is doing a context-based zoning ordinance that's based on the existing built environment of the city, is you need to understand that existing built environment. The pattern book was our attempt to do that. There had never been a real comprehensive study of the entire city, really into the details of its buildings, the lots, and the streets, and how they all lay out. So that work was done largely in 2016, and the result of that work, beyond a great big document that everyone's encouraged to check out online, we have now a database that has all the information about the physical characteristics of Newton's neighborhoods. This, of course, has been an incredibly valuable tool for us then in how we go forward and develop the standards for this first draft. So one of the key things we learned in doing this pattern book was that the city right now is roughly 87% non-conforming with the existing zoning ordinance. So what does that mean? So to be non-conforming it means that some aspect of a property, one or more aspects of the property, is not consistent with the current zoning ordinance as it is today. Most commonly in Newton, that's because the lot, was built before zoning occurred or before that key 1941 zoning ordinance. So that's the most common reason someone might have a non-conforming property. So what does it mean for a homeowner to be non-conforming? And in this situation, what we're talking about is the exception becomes the rule. So for a homeowner, that frequently means a longer, more expensive review for simple home improvements. For a neighbor, it means that you don't necessarily have clarity as to what can be done with the property next door, because when a property is non-conforming, they can ask for a permit that allows them to continue or expand that non-conformity. And finally, for the city, it reduces the strength of the ordinance. If the primary role of the ordinance, when you're 87% non-conforming, is managing non-conformity, you're not necessarily setting a vision for the future of the city through that ordinance. So I mentioned before we did a series of events back in 2017. It was a series of 9 meetings, each one digging into a particular topic related to the zoning ordinance. Each one featured a presentation with ideas of things that could be included in the zoning ordinance and opportunities for conversation and feedback. So now for a guide to reading the draft ordinance. First thing to think about is each of you have some handouts that relate to this. Setting the standards that are our starting point in this first draft. The standards that we have right now were developed using the data from the pattern book. The standards reflect an objective of achieving a 75 to 80% conformity rate. So what does that mean? That means that we looked at the data on, for example, setbacks. And we said, what do we need to set the setbacks for in order to achieve a 75 to 80% conforming rate? And so those are the numbers we use as a starting point for this conversation. But this conversation now switches, right? Because conformity isn't the only objective we have as a city with regard to zoning. There's a lot of other things that we need to accomplish. There are a lot of other things that we're interested in as a city. So now the conversation switches to how much are we willing to move these numbers, perhaps increasing the rate of nonconformity, but balancing that against other objectives we might have. So as an example, side setbacks. This is one of the places where we didn't follow our own rule within the standards. Side setbacks, if we had used the 75 to 80% conforming rule, side setbacks we would have been forced to set them at 0. Because in fact, there's such a huge degree of nonconformity on side setbacks. So many houses are close that to get to that rule, we would have had to set it to 0. And that didn't seem reasonable, and that didn't seem to fit within the feedback we've already heard from many community members. So we set that number in different districts at between 7.5, that represents the current standard in many districts, all the way up to 10 and higher in other districts. Lastly, when we think about these policy objectives and making changes of the ordinance, it's important to remember that we're balancing a lot of competing interests. Of course, one of the key interests is property rights, always an issue when you're looking at zoning. Particularly within that, the idea of reasonable expansion versus teardowns. Those two things kind of sit opposite of each other in many ways. If you allow additional space in the building area on a lot to allow reasonable expansion of a property, you're also potentially allowing someone the sufficient space to incentivize tearing down the property. So that's a really important balancing act. Property values and tax revenue are always important. We have to understand how zoning impacts those things and balance those factors. And then of course there's the long-standing issue of neighborhood character and of course the evolution of neighborhoods, villages, and cities over time. Also important to remember when you're reading the draft zoning ordinance is, one of the ideas we like to refer to is separating mechanisms and standards. So a mechanism is a tool within the zoning ordinance. It's something as simple as a height requirement or a setback requirement. The standard is the actual number applied. So if the mechanism is a front setback, so that houses are set back from the street, the standard would be whatever that number is, 20 feet, 25 feet, whatever it might be. It's also important to remember that all of the rules apply comprehensively. You can't cherry pick. Well, thank you. You can't cherry pick which rules to apply and then understand what can be done on a lot. Thank you. All the standards apply at once. On a lot, you have to not only have enough space for the building that you'd like to build, but you also have to have enough space for the parking, the stormwater infrastructure that you might have to install. Everything applies all at once. Another important rule for us as we were working on drafting was simplicity. We aimed for no math more complicated than addition or subtraction, which is certainly not a knock on the intelligence of this community, but instead is recognizing that when you put complicated math in, frankly, you create more space and more opportunities for monkeying with the numbers. And similarly, we aimed for measurements that were simple. So the ordinance consists of 12 total articles. Some of the important ones I'm going to highlight. General standards in Article 2. That represents the rules, like how the ordinance works. That's where we define how to measure height, how to determine how many units can be built on a piece of property. Those are the rules. Those are the kind of the rules of the game, if you will. But the standards are found in the districts through Article 3 through 7, and then other rules can be found in development standards and use standards. And then the administration, the decision-making process is in Article 10 on nonconformity, where you find out if you're non-conforming in some way, shape, or form, how decisions are made as to what you can do with your property. And then the administration section covers things like special permits and variances. So the district standards are where you're going to find the standards that apply to lots. Setbacks, frontage standards, lot coverage, and what building types are allowed within a district. So everyone has in front of them, or should have when they came in, a description of their particular zoning district from the back. So if you didn't grab that, you should. Looks something like this. It's actually a page out of the draft ordinance. And that gives you the information about lot standards. And also very importantly, in terms of the definition of what can happen in a district, it defines the building types.
Is this as it is today, or is as the first draft is written?
This is the first draft, as the first draft is written.
But you don't tell it how it differs from what it is today.
We just provided the first draft information. So, building types is the other sheet of paper you should have received. We made our best effort to estimate what building type everyone had on their piece of property existing today. And this is the information that defines what the size, the massing can be of a building, of that building. So it collects all into one place, these rules, and places them together in relation to similar types of buildings. So what is a building type? Building type is a set of rules that apply to, for example, a shop house, which is this very small-scale mixed-use building, or to a house B, which is our most common building type in the entire city. It's about a medium-sized house. So all the rules that apply to that type of building are found on that page. Then you have in Article 8, the development standards. This is where you can find the rules around parking, stormwater management, incentives for sustainable building design, that's green environmental design. Signage is also in this district. So these are rules that apply to development all across the city in all districts. Article 9 is where you find the rules that are specific to specific uses. So for example, one of the uses allowed in this first draft ordinance is a brewery. There are specific criteria tied to that brewery that are designed to ensure compatibility with the level of activity in the area. Similarly, manufacturing as a use has specific rules tied to it to make it more compatible with the surrounding area. To go into the draft zoning ordinance, some of the principles that we used as we were putting together this map, which I believe we have posters of the map in the back of the room, if you're interested. So amongst our rules, again, coming back to this idea of nonconformity, minimizing the degree of nonconformity. Within this, you know, it says the exception does not make the rule, which is basically to say that if there was a block that had a single two-family on it, that didn't turn that block into a two-family district, still within the single-family district. When we were putting together the lines between the districts, we tried to the extent possible to put those lines down the backs of property rather than down the street, so that like faces like within the zoning ordinance, so that when I'm walking down a street, both sides of the street appear approximately the same, at least appear to be within the same zoning district. The boundaries between these districts occur when there's a shift in the patterns of development, when there's a shift in the types of buildings, the scale of those buildings, the scale of the lots that they sit on, so on and so forth. And we literally did a block-by-block analysis of the city as we were putting together these districts. So there's the zoning map. Again, it's available in the back of the room, and I encourage folks to take a look at it if you haven't yet had a chance. Now, there's broadly two types of zoning district represented within the ordinance and on the maps. The majority of the districts on the maps are what we're calling the contextual districts. These are the residence districts that apply to most neighborhoods within the city, and then the village districts that apply to most of the village centers. These are the districts that really reflect those historic development patterns and the buildings that you find within them. The non-contextual districts are those parts of the city that stand apart, stand out, and don't really fit in, if you will. They are, on one hand, public buildings and things like the golf courses, large properties like that, the cemetery, and then they are these single-purpose districts, which are things like the manufacturing districts, the large commercial properties like the Chestnut Hill Mall, and large residential properties like the Chestnut Hill Towers, Manhattan Woods, and so on. These are, again, properties that really are exceptions to the rule of how Newton otherwise developed over time. When you look at the village districts, you see a pattern of development when you look at the villages in Newton as they exist today, where the highest intensity buildings are found at the center of our villages. Newton Corner, the highest building is right at the center. We've zoned those intense buildings in the Village 3 district. And then the zoning steps down from there. So you see the next lighter shade is the Village 2, and then the Village 1, and then it steps down into the adjoining residential neighborhoods. Now, Newton Center is very different from Newton Corner, and in that case, you don't have a large building in the center. The largest buildings in the center reflect the Village 2 district, and so that village starts at the Village 2 and then steps down from there. Now, there's three places that where the zoning map does not reflect the existing conditions on the ground. One of those is Needham Street, where we did where last spring, the planning department, working with a group of citizens, completed a vision plan, and the first draft zoning map reflects the results of that process. Washington Street, what is on the map right now does reflect existing conditions, but we've shown a dashed red line around the study area for the Washington Street visioning process. Now that's a separate process, a separate project from this project, but also includes proposed zoning. And there's a meeting on Monday, hosted by the Zoning and Planning Committee, where the second draft of the vision plan and the zoning will be released. So there'll be a presentation. I encourage folks to attend that to understand what's going on there. And then the last exception, if you will, is the Riverside property down at the end of the green line. In this case, we used the Village 3 district, as that's the district that most closely matches the project that was approved by special permit a number of years ago. But we're kind of in a wait and see mode to see what happens. We have a visioning process beginning there, and we have a special permit process we anticipate beginning sometime this year that'll help us define what the appropriate zoning district might be on this property. So key features in the zoning ordinance. So one of the things that we highlight, so this was kind of like, what, a normal street in Newton. Row of houses on similarly sized lots, similarly sized houses. Except that what we know is that a normal street in Newton has a great deal more variety than that. It'll have a double lot, which then has the potential, under our current rules, to have a double-sized building. And even more significant is there are lots that have long tails, that have additional land area in the back, that then translates into a large building in the front. It's very frequent in Newton because Newton has a lot of wetlands and a lot of steep slopes. So these areas are not buildable, or were not buildable in the past, but were incorporated into lots to make these extra large lots. And so we see results like this, where this is a by right development, by right meaning it did not require any special review. But that building clearly stands out from its neighbors.
Where is that?
That's in West Newton. So another feature of the zoning ordinance is, of course, our parking and transportation standards. Amongst the things that we have included in the first draft, our existing ordinance requires bike parking, but we are upping the requirements for bicycle parking. We're also reducing the automobile minimum parkings and adding the idea of maximum amounts of parking. We're allowing sharing. We're proposing to allow sharing of underutilized parking areas. And then we're introducing an important idea of transportation demand management. This is an idea that the City Council has been using extensively on special permit applications. We'd like to see this standardized within the base zoning ordinance. Basically, transportation demand management is a series of site design features and operations for development projects that reduce reliance on single occupant vehicles. So they encourage the use of bicycling, they encourage the use of carpooling, alternative vehicles, other approaches to getting to from a piece of property. These rules would apply to large-scale development projects in the future. We're also including standards and incentives related to sustainable buildings and environmental site design, green design, if you will. These are standards around how do we build in to the zoning, making our buildings more energy efficient, addressing concerns about climate change, how do we create incentives for that, and how do we address things like stormwater, flooding, and other issues that can be attended with building. The zoning ordinance also includes some standards and ideas around arts and cultural institutions and encouraging these in the city. It's not yet reflected in the draft ordinance, but we're looking at standards that would actually, for large projects, create a requirement for some contribution to the arts, on-site, sculptural, or other artistic features. And we've created some new use categories that make it easier to establish arts-related uses within the city. Development review is an important part of the ordinance. What we're proposing is that while right now we kind of have two options when it comes to development review. A project is either by right, which basically means it meets all the rules, and someone can proceed directly to pulling a building permit, or they can seek a special permit from the city council. We believe that we should have a development review process where the process that one goes through reflects the scale and significance of the project that's being proposed. So, by virtue of doing a more conforming ordinance, the rules will apply more clearly to properties, and more small-scale changes to individual homes, adding on a porch, small additions and so on, will fall within the by right category. We're including a new category of site plan approval, which would be used in situations where a project would be by right. The ordinance provides very clear standards with very little discretion. But otherwise, these projects would be reviewed by staff and go straight to building permit from there. Section 6 findings, this comes back again to this idea of nonconformity. So right now, if you have a non-conforming structure or building, you are in a special permit process. This proposes instead that you go through what's a Section 6 finding process as allowed under Chapter 48 of the state code. The ZBA would be the body that would handle this review process. The standard would remain the same as it is today under the special permit. Finally, we would propose to split the special permit review process between the planning board and the city council, with the planning board receiving smaller projects, and then larger projects deemed to be of citywide scale or importance would go to the city council. Right now, we've drawn that line at approximately 20 residential units or 20,000 square feet of commercial. But really, that's part of this ongoing conversation, is where the right place is to draw that line in terms of scale and community significance. But overall, we think it's important to clarify this process, reduce the burden on the city council, and match the development review process to the scale of the project. So let's zoom in on Ward 1 for a moment. Here's our current zoning map. For those who are familiar with it, much of it is within the MR, which is the multi-residence 1 and multi-residence 2 districts. The reddish colors are the commercial districts, and then the purple is the manufacturing districts. Under the first draft map, the MR1 and 2 are rolled into the R3 district. We have some neighborhood general zones, some village zones that we've talked about, and then that quasi-purplish color is the fabrication district, which is the future of the manufacturing district.
What's that red stuff in the red dot? Is that the
This-
development that they're planning to put in?
This dotted red line refers to the Washington Street study area.
So what is the count zone for that right now?
We'll do questions at the end.
Oh, okay.
We have lots and lots of time for questions, yeah, but the dotted red line is the Washington Street vision and zoning area. Again, the zoning that's here is reflective of the existing conditions on the ground.
Do you mind walking, flipping back and forth between those two maps once or twice, please? So we can get.
Yeah, now, these maps are on the back walls as well.
We get a
And
copy
they're
of
long.
these slideshows as well?
That's it. Is this a slideshow we can put online?
We can.
Yeah, all right, so this is available online, or will be available online. All right, so let's go into the R3 district. So this is the sheet of paper I think many of you have in front of you. Things I'm gonna highlight, first off, what's by right? What can you do by right? Yeah, House B, which is our medium-sized house, most common house in Newton. House C, which is a smaller house, and then a 2-unit house, very common within the district. Then the site plan approval, which I've referred to before, is by right, but it requires that one meet this proximity rule, which basically says that in order to build what we're termed here as an apartment house and a small apartment building, you must be able to find 3 examples of that same building type within 500 feet. And that has to be checked by staff and confirmed. So I'll go into details of what these are in a minute, but the rule is, in order to build the apartment house, you'd have to find 3 of that. Okay, let me skip to it. Here we go, yeah. You'd have to find 3 of that particular building type, and for the small apartment building, it's the same thing. You have to find 3 within 500 feet. So what is the apartment house? As we've written the standards at this point, which we anticipate could change over time, the apartment house is a 2,500 square foot footprint, maximum of 3 stories, and within that, it's really a maximum of 3 to 6 units. So with the incentives that we built in for green or sustainable design, or for a project that's 100% affordable units, you could bring that up to 8 units. So this is a building type that's actually quite common and reflective of various parts of Newton, particularly up in Ward 1. Similarly, the small apartment building is exactly that. It's a small apartment building. It has a maximum footprint of 4,200 square feet, maximum of 3 stories, and within this, you get 3 to 10 units, or again, with the incentives for green design or a project that's 100% affordable, you can get up to 14 units. Again, I think I already spoke to this, the proximity requirement. You have to find 3 of the same building type within 500 feet for you to be able to do this without having to seek a special permit. And again, as we talked about, all the rules apply comprehensively. So not only do you have to find 3 of those types, but you also have to fit your building within the setbacks. You have to stay under the lot coverage requirement. You have to provide 1 parking space per unit. You have to manage your stormwater. You have to provide the outdoor amenity space requirement. And the list of requirements goes on from there. Special permits within this district are required for apartment houses and small apartment buildings where they do not meet the proximity test. And then for any rear lot subdivision, which is consistent with our existing zoning ordinance, for a multi-unit conversion, which is the conversion of a large single-family house or a building like a church or something along those lines. If you want to convert that into a multi-unit residential use, that requires a special permit, again, as with our existing zoning ordinance. And then the courtyard cluster, which is the idea of small, single or 2-family buildings clustered around a shared common green space. This is a new idea for Newton, and we're using it to replace the townhouses in the R3 district, which we believe, both in the way they've been built and the way they could be built, are not consistent with the character of the R3 district. Next steps. So our process, as we are wrapping up these word-by-word meetings, to review feedback we're getting on the first draft, questions, concerns, continue to meet with neighborhood groups, and we're going to establish office hours again this spring, and then develop new zoning text and a new zoning map for city council consideration. We're anticipating having that second draft in the end of May, beginning of June timeframe. We continue to meet with the Zoning and Planning Committee of the City Council regularly. In February, very important to note, we have a build-out analysis that we'll be sharing with the City Council, February 25th, I believe, which is going to look at both the current and the first draft ordinance, what can be done under either of these ordinances, particularly looking at issues of vulnerability to tear downs for different building types under each of the ordinances. We've also been doing we'll be doing quarterly discussions with the entire city council on this project. Also doing these word-by-word meetings co-hosted with our city councilors. We are just over halfway through, so we have a number of these still to go. Once we've completed these meetings, we'd like to start meeting with other community groups and digging in deeper into the zoning ordinance, getting into details and questions. So this is the introduction, the appetizer. We'll look forward to some of us inviting us over for dinner. And then, as I said, we're going to reinstitute office hours in the spring. Basically, we'll set some times where people can just come in and talk to us. This is my property. Tell me what's going on here. I'm very concerned or very happy with X or Y. Tell me more. There's a ton of information up on our website, including, of course, the full text of the draft ordinance. There's an interactive map up there now. You click on that and then type in your address, and it'll tell you your current zoning and your zoning under the first draft. Tons of information. Every single memo we've submitted to the Zoning and Planning Committee can be found there, and then archive of materials dating all the way through this process from 2016 up to now. And of course, emails, you can email us at zoningredesign@newtonma.gov. So with that, we would love to start taking questions.
One quick announcement, I just want to let people know, there are some seats up in the front here, now would be a good time while I'm babbling on to grab a seat. I counted 7 vacant seats, so you don't need to stand. So I just wanted to recognize Councilor Ciccone, who's joined us this evening. You missed my thing, I pronounced Ciociara the wrong way, probably pronounced it the wrong way again.
You can take Italian classes here.
Yeah, so why isn't it Ciccione? Ciccone, see, okay, good, all right, great. So I know Councilor Leary has a special announcement before we get to questions.
We just want to recognize somebody's birthday today. Councilor Ciccone is here, and we want to sing him happy birthday. We have a small cake here, so please join us in singing happy birthday to Jay. Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Jay. Happy birthday to you.
Okay, so with that, the microphone Barney has may or may not work. If it does not, what we'll do is, if you say your question, we'll repeat it here.
Pretend this is working.
But we'll repeat the questions up here and take some notes. And actually, should you mind taking some notes for us? Or nice? Up on the. All right.
Ready?
I'm ready. I see a hand way in the back. Go first.
I'll just go ahead, I just want to know, if maybe this hasn't been decided yet, but how is this rezoning going to affect property tax rates?
So nothing has been decided yet. We're on first draft, and it does not reflect tax rates.
It's not, well, say for example, you have something right now that's like a 48 unit building, I mean, how would that be done under this, I guess it'd be under R3? It's not going to affect any individual properties?
So the question, and I want to repeat the question back to, in case someone can't hear in the middle. The question was about and correct me if I get the question wrong too, okay? The question was, how does, basically the interplay between zoning and tax rates, correct?
Yeah, so say for example, if you have a 3-family or you're looking 4 and 8, or there's different categories right now in the city. So how does those individual property building X, how is its tax rate going to be affected by this rezoning?
Gotcha. So the tax rates are, the setting of tax rates is a separate process from the setting of zoning. So that's setting of the categories. When a building use changes, the assessment, or a new assessment is done. So if you have a 3-unit building and you added a 4th by right because you could go through all of those steps, you would get a new assessment.
Higher, right?
I don't actually know. Probably yes. Let's stick way in the back.
Sure. It's a multiple part question, so I'll understand if you can only answer a couple of these. What's the logic behind allowing multiple unit apartment buildings in an R3 zone where we already have a high level of population density? How small or big of a lot can you put a 14-unit apartment building? What's the minimum size?
All right. So I'm going to repeat the question first. Actually, Barney, would you mind writing the questions up so we keep a log? I'm going to see if I can repeat that question first, and again, correct me if I get it wrong. So the question was, how large of a lot would you need to be able to get a 14-unit apartment building on? Okay. So to do 14 units, step 1 is that you have to commit that you're doing either 100% affordable or a green design. You have to get to that incentive point to get to 14 units. So those are your 2 choices. Either it's you meet the really high green standard, which is yet to be set, but we're thinking LEED silver, LEED gold, something like that. Or you'd have to commit to being 100% affordable. Then you'd be looking at, you have to have, give me a second to get a calculator. The way we've set units is that you have to have at least 1,250 square feet of building area, gross building area per unit. So you need to, times 14.
But
You need to
smaller.
be able to build a 17,500 square foot building to get 14 units. With the incentives, actually, it's different. So,
900.
so sorry, let me correct that. So it's
900.
900 times 4, 900 times 14, so 12,600 square feet of building to make that happen. You have a 3-story building maximum, 3-story height maximum, so you divide that by 3. You need to be able to fit a 4,200 square foot footprint to make that work. Then you also have to find the, so that's work calculating backwards, right, to get to the building size. Then you have to find those 3 in the vicinity or get a special permit. Last step is that you have to then have a vehicle for each of those, a parking space for each of those 14 units.
Special
And
permit under 20
one space
units,
for each of those
up to
14
20
units.
can be approved by
And you
the
need to be
planning
able
board under the
to
new
meet your
plan.
stormwater requirements and your setbacks. And your lot coverage. So lot coverage, I believe, is 60% in the R3. So calculate again up from there. You need at least 7,000 square feet, but you have to then also fit the setbacks and the parking. So the challenge is going to be that 14 space parking area on 7,000 square feet where you've got a 4,200 square foot building. So that's where it gets tricky. It's not a straight answer.
No, I'm sorry, I'm going to pick up the whole section. The R3 designation, is that been set in stone?
No. So the question, just to repeat the question, sorry again, for those in the middle, the question was, is the R3 designation set in stone? And the answer is no. Let's go in the middle.
Can you talk about the theory of encouraging density in the context of this zoning law?
So the question was, and again, correct me if I get the question wrong, can we talk about the theory of encouraging density in the context of this ordinance draft? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Somebody articulate why density is being encouraged.
So as Jane was talking about, we really focused in on what the building types are on the ground. The areas that we've designated R3 have a mix. So there's a lot of 2-unit buildings in those areas. There are some 3, 4, 5-unit buildings in those areas, and there are already some buildings that are of this 8 to 10 unit scale. So what we've looked at is we wanted to make those conforming. How do we look at making those conforming? So that's why those building types are in there as a starting point. And then you look at how do we actually, what happens next? So we did look at, is there a way to sort of thread the needle between the folks who are saying absolutely no anything new, and the folks who are saying, hey, we need more housing, we need new types of housing, we need more buildings with elevators, etc. So we were looking for something that's kind of in the middle. We're not sure that we've hit on it yet, but that's how we got there. Let's go over here.
We had a meeting last night in the corner. We had a meeting last night and we considered the whole question of diversity, inclusiveness, having low-income housing and so forth. But the thing we really got stuck on is that it appears in the ordinance that R3 is the zone where all this increased density is going to go. And if you look at the map of Newton that you published, perhaps 10% of the map is R3, and the lion's share of the map is R1 and R2. So that all of those things we would do for social purposes are all being pushed into the R3 zone, which is only 10% of the geography. And how is that fair that that part of the city has to have the burden and the rest of the city can feel good about what we do about diversity, but doesn't have any impact in their neighborhoods?
All right. So,
Bingo.
Who wants to handle that one?
all right. So, we mapped what's on the ground.
Should we put it back up? Let's just get it right up there so people can see it.
So I'm going to go back to those 2 maps of Newton Corner. This is the current zoning map, and this is the proposed draft map. We looked at where the patterns were. So that looks at where there are shifts, where are the current 2, 3, 4+ unit buildings? And we mapped those areas where there was a predominance of that into the R3. And we mapped areas where there were predominantly single unit, with maybe 1 or 2 units as the R2.
You want to flip back and forth a little bit?
In Ward 1 is primarily right now, and the brown here, the light brown here is the MR1 district, and the darker brown is the MR2 district. The MR1
What's the
district,
yellow?
and the yellow is the 1 unit district, the the single resident district. So these are, I don't remember which one's which, I think this is SR2 and this might be
There's two
SR3.
in that neighborhood, right
So-
now.
Yeah, so again, we were looking at the predominant patterns.
So the brown zones are MR zones right now, which is a multifamily zone?
Right, so what I was gonna say is that the MR1 district is a 1 to 2 unit district by right. The MR2 districts are 1 to 2 units by right, and the option to go up from there. So by special permit, already today, someone could come in and ask for a special permit to do a 3, 4, or 5 unit building in those areas.
What is that gold color?
And the gold is the single unit. This is the SR2, I believe, and this is, I believe, the SR3. And I may have those switched, and I'm sorry if I got that.
Those are going to R3.
So again, looking at the patterns on the ground today, and that's really where we started, is what's out there. So the patterns that are on the ground today, we looked at this map, but this actually wasn't our starting point. Our starting point was what's on the ground today. It's that pattern book. It's that data that you think of. If you were to look at Google Maps today, or the assessor's database, it's going to tell you what's actually on the lot as opposed to what's allowed by zoning. So that's how we get to this map. So things like where we draw this line. The lot widths change from this part of the street to this part of the street. That's why there's a pattern break there. We looked at those pattern breaks, and that's where we drew the lines.
On the justice issue, can I get Mike again, just follow up?
It's got to be a quick one though, because I got a lot of people.
You didn't address the justice question of why the current districts that are becoming in the new zoning R1s and R2 have no upzoning provisions so that they have to share some of the burden of increased density. That's the key question.
So that is a policy question, which is where we're at today, is to have those policy conversations. The zoning and planning committee is wrestling with these topics.
That's a good question, but it is very much a policy question and very much relates to what James was talking about in terms of the context that exists today. So,
My only concern is, and it's a very strong one, why are we looking to the past to determine what's going to happen in the future? Why are we looking to the past to determine what's going to happen in the future? If we had a Confederate statue someplace, and there are members of my family who are dealing with this, we wouldn't just argue because it's there, we should keep it there. And I think the same perspective can be brought to this issue. Whether you call it policy or whether you call it starting with patterns, there's a very important question, and that is, what should Newton look like going forward?
agreed. So, James referenced this in partial answer to your question, which is the areas that,
Repeat the question.
I'm not sure I can. So, you want to repeat it one more time loud?
My basic point is, why should Newton look to the past in order to design the future? And I referenced the fact that members of my family are dealing with the issue of Confederate statues. That, of course, is, leads to a whole different series of questions. But the impetus is the same. Like, if we have certain goals for which we are striving, one of which is diversity within the city of Newton, then why are we only looking at certain areas to build that diversity?
So, just real briefly, in partial response to that is, I think we mentioned that areas where we're looking to make significant change, we're doing much more of a community effort and vision plan. We did that with, James referenced earlier, Needham Street. We're doing that now with Washington Street. We're going to be starting
They're trying
something
to ignore
Riverside
what
Sunday,
public
for those
wants.
of you that are interested, in terms of a vision plan. And that is with an eye toward the future, but Newton is a big city, so tackling it all at once can be a little bit challenging, as you're seeing tonight, so.
I think there's a question of perspective here. Let me just go from the broader policy issues.
Open to your mind.
Not one. Outlined by Richard Robin from Newton Corner. And there's a detail here, which is you're basing your pattern book on what was in the past and on the assessor's database. And one thing is that if you look at many of the houses that are classified as R3, many of them are single-family, not multifamily. And they look much more like the R2 houses. And I think that this is creating an artificial separation between parts of Newton, particularly north of the Turnpike in Newton Corner.
Can I ask
I don't know if you guys
a
want to take
follow-up
that.
question on that? Is the idea you're aiming for that more should be more like the R2 or more like the R3 or somewhere in the middle, or not quite sure yet?
My point is that we need to rethink the designation of R3 based on what is presently existing. From our perspective in the Newton Corner Association, we have identified the fact that many of the houses that are considered multifamily are single-family, with an occasional in-law apartment. And I know that to be the fact along some houses on Jewett Street. And I think that if we think about the R3 designation, it creates a artificial separation between large parts of Newton and the smaller section of Newton around the Turnpike and in other areas. So I think that needs to be rethought.
Okay, let's go to another question. Yeah, right here in the front.
So in the R3, by right, a 2,700 square foot lot would support a 4,800 square foot house. And a 3,400 square foot lot would support a 6,000 square foot two-family. And that's by right. And that, I think, will change the neighborhood, and the look of the neighborhood. You want to keep it similar, and I think that's a big difference. My question, though, is the fellow's question earlier, that a 12,600 square foot apartment building could be built on a 7,000 square foot lot, but you would have to go in front of the planning board for a special permit. Is that planning board selected by the mayor and not elected officials?
So the planning board is,
Yep.
which Brian actually is an ex officio member, sitting with them when they meet. They are appointed by the mayor but confirmed by city council. So they have to have there's a confirmation process.
Right, they serve for 3-year terms to start, so. All right, all right, we got one right here.
Hold on, but I
Oh,
just-
go ahead, James has a.
Also,
an
last
add-on.
point on that is
Yeah.
that there's no reason in this process that we can't redefine the planning board. So, let's
As an
just,
elected body,
as what, I just said redefine the planning board. I didn't finish the sentence.
I think what
Redefine
you're
the planning board
saying
in all different
is
ways.
everything is fair game at this point, so, all right, here we go, right here.
I just wanted to know what is the present, current zoning of that red dot, and is that person potentially whoever bought it, did they also buy the city yard?
Is that this one?
All the red dots here, no, the red dots.
That's the
red
outline
dots.
for the Washington Street
Yes.
study. It doesn't identify a particular development, that's just the lots within the red dot. It
That
goes
includes
further,
the city yard,
it
it
goes
looks to
further
me,
west.
I'm pretty familiar
Yeah,
with
yeah,
that.
it does.
So they're taking the city yard out and putting in, what I understand, 450 units, 12 stories high. They're taking out the city yard, and that's putting it right in our backyard. And I wanna know what the current zoning is. That's the city yard, that's the dot to dot. And also I wanna know, the second question is, I don't think people are all aware of this, but that's what's planning to come, and we all need to be aware of this. Number two, I wanna ask, what is the current zoning of that dot to dot right there? Whoever bought it knowing what the current zoning is, and why do we have to change it? So what is the current zoning right now?
Okay.
Okay, so let me address the first thing, the city lot, I can let the city council speak to this as well, the city yard is still the city yard, there aren't any plans that I know of to change that right now. The outline on the map, you see the dotted line, that's the area of Washington Street that's under study right now. The second draft of that study will be out February 11th. That'll propose some zoning for that area. So this kind of shows what exists today, right, Rachel? So that's what you have there.
This is the current zoning for that area. So it's a mix. So you have a business zone here along Washington Street. Purple is the bright purple, that's manufacturing.
Right, so that on the corner there is the Whole Foods. Behind it is an industrial area. And that green area is where the city DPW yard is.
Okay, so that that is in the red dot, so we have to change that.
So this is the manufacturing, that green is the city yard again.
Yeah, we just used different colors in the new zoning. It's the same designation.
But I thought it was one person bought all of that, and that's what they're planning to do. So it's currently zoned.
Yes.
Is it currently zoned for 12 stories and?
No, it's not. Absolutely not.
So
No.
why do we have to change it? The person bought it knowing they bought
So,
it the way it was.
I
Why do we have
I don't want to get
change
into the speculation on who owns it or what can happen there, because I don't know the answer at this point, but I do want to get some
it?
more
Oh, okay.
questions.
All right.
Thank you.
That's all, thank you.
Good question.
Thank you.
I think there's probably a lot to like in the new zoning, but I think we focus on the things that are threatening to us. And again, I live like a lot of people here in the R3 zone, and I guess you've heard it from a few people here that we're not real happy about apartment houses in the R3 zone. And I can say that I live on a street that's all two-family houses and single-family houses. I think if you ask the people in that neighborhood whether they like the neighborhood, they would say they like it. If you ask them if they wanted 8 and 10 unit apartment houses replacing their two families on 7,000 square foot lots, they probably have a big problem with that. And I would say that, you know, as I read this proposal, the way I understand it is if there's a cluster of 3 apartment houses, apartment buildings, there's a definition of what these are. There's the small apartment building mode. If there are 3 of those and you're within 500 feet of that location, somebody could buy your two-family house and put up another one of those 8 or 10 unit buildings. Once they get 3 of those in your neighborhood, then the whole thing's extended another 500 feet. And this apartment house form of development can extend across the entire neighborhood of this part of Newton, and there go all the 2 families, because anybody that's got any sense is going to sell their house to a developer who wants to put in dense housing. So this is a formula for, there goes our neighborhood, there go our 2 families and our single families, which we all pretty much like. So, you know, I think there needs to be some rethinking about that.
Thank you.
Want to respond to that, Rachel? If we can avoid the clapping, just nodding heads is great, so go ahead. Yeah.
No, it's a great comment. It's
Yeah,
a great comment.
It is a good comment. We're hearing some of that feedback. It is challenging in terms of meeting all the criteria as well. So we had a comment over here.
Can you come toward the back?
I'm working my way back there.
Not very fast.
Okay. Tell these people to stop raising their hands and I'll get right back.
Come on back.
Unfortunately, they're not going to be able to clap anymore after what I say, because Barney stopped the clapping. I want to give a different perspective about why I like density. I didn't know about the social engineering that I've heard about, but my married daughter with 2 beautiful grandchildren cannot buy here and live near me, and I hate it, and I want more affordable housing stock for her. My single daughter can't rent here, and I hate it, and I want more apartments for her. And my mother-in-law couldn't live here because there was nothing accessible in her budget. So for me, density is really personal, and it's really important, and it's not about social engineering.
Okay. Question in the back. All right. There we go.
Yeah, my question is around how the proposed ordinances would deal with the issue of Airbnb, and specifically non-owner occupied Airbnb, so people who are own property in a residential zone who don't actually live in the town and are operating a business in a residential zone. would that require business zoning? Thanks.
So it's a really good question. When we wrote this and released it in October, the state had not yet landed where they have in the last month on Airbnb. So we are looking at what the state recently passed and are working on new language related to that. So I don't have an answer for you tonight, but we are looking into the issue because the state did change their definitions of the different types of short-term rentals.
And we can add, though, that the Zoning and Planning Committee and the City Council will be taking that issue up this spring. Now that the state has made their decisions and figured out how it works, we're going to move forward and get that zoning in place sooner than this will happen.
Well, I tell you that the person who's using it in my neighborhood and for high school parties, it's appreciated, and time is of the essence.
We'd like to talk to you afterwards about the address.
Yeah,
So, that'd be
great.
good. Yeah. Okay, friends in the back here, yep.
Yeah, I have one comment and two questions. And the first question is, well, actually, let me start with the comment. I don't know if people here really understand that at the end of all this, with all this R3 zoning change, that there's gonna be a really big tax bill at the end. I'm gonna get to that. With respect to my question, has the planning and zoning department figured out what it's gonna cost for increased infrastructure when all these new apartment buildings come in and you're gonna be basically taxing an existing sewer system and an existing water system? And we all know that we pay for water and sewer through our taxes. Has that been factored in?
Which is going up.
And then number two is the press here. Because I think the press should be part of this and make these issues known to everyone in the city so everyone can put a voice to this and show their opposition. And I agree with the gentleman who said that this part of Newton is being unfairly targeted when the rest of Newton, south of the turnpike, enjoys these million-dollar single-family homes. It's not fair, it's not equitable. And to the lady who would like to see, yes, those are my questions. And the last point is, to the woman that'd like to see affordable housing, well, sorry, this is not nearly simple.
Let's keep this simple, okay? Let's not pick out people, okay? I'm gonna be hard on that, okay? Thank you. All right. Okay, well, there was a question in there, I think.
So what you're referring to is what we refer to as fiscal impact analysis, right? That's understanding the cost and revenue relative to development. And we actually have a presentation coming up on March 19th. The City Council will be receiving a presentation from our fiscal impact analysis consultant who is basically going to walk through the whole process of how fiscal impact analysis really is done, how you understand what those costs are in terms of infrastructure, in terms of services, and the revenue side of that, what's the revenue profile, and how the city can balance and address those issues. So I encourage folks to look out for that presentation on March 19th.
Great. I'm just gonna throw in another PSA, just that the anxiety level is getting up there, so we can tone things down a little bit, that would be great. These are all great questions.
I have a question on the special permit process. If what you say is true, and this passes, not the zone, it's just the process itself, and we reduce the non-conformity to 75%. So we reduce the load on the city council by 75% with the special permit process. Why then are we taking the decision-making process out of our elected people's hands, who we live with, into an appointed body who doesn't even live in Newton, and all the, well, not all of these, but the decisions that are gonna be made are gonna be clinical. Right now, everyone in this room, single-family home, two-family home, if they go for a special permit, they go before their elected officials. 3 of them in each ward. What is the benefit to each person in this room, not to the city, not to the city council, by having this process go forward? Thank you.
So, to clear one thing up, the planning board are members that have to be residents of Newton. They are residents of Newton, they get appointed by the mayor, and they are confirmed by the city council. Those are the members of the board. They are unelected at the moment. As James said, everything's on the table. There could be a change to
Zoning
that.
board's unelected as well, they're numbered unelected bodies. And
I get it,
and
just
just,
a board of aldermen is elected.
right, and there are lots of,
Council, sorry.
there are lots of models out there for how communities deal with special permits. Some have elected officials, that's not the norm for most communities. It's usually planning boards that deal with it, so it's not a model that's uncommon. As James said, we have a long way to go in terms of determining what that level is. So
Historically, Newton has led the way. There's no reason
we
for
want
us
to
to take
continue
a
to lead the way.
backseat.
Okay, great, thank you. Mr. Harrington, I'm gonna hold the mic for you.
You get it back.
I don't need a microphone, okay. I have one comment that you say the math is simple, adding and subtracting, but as we saw this evening, there's also multiplication by decimals in order to determine your building area, because we don't have lot sizes. So maybe you could correct that on your presentation, that it's simple math, but it's addition, subtraction, and multiplication, and using decimals. The other comment I had is that you keep referring to the planning board, and I wondered if that is the same board that's called the Planning and Development Board and if it is, why don't you correct that so that it doesn't say planning board, it says Planning and Development Board, so we'd know what board you were talking about, we could look it up in the chart, and we'd have a better understanding. And then,
Great now.
the final thing that I have a lot more, but the final thing for now. I've lived in this area for 50 years, I represented it on the Board of Aldermen, I represented the area in the State House, I know a lot of people around here, and so I have heard from people about this proposal that you have. And one of the things that people seem to be most concerned about in this area now, I'm talking about Nonantum, Newton Corner, Newtonville, West Newton. The biggest concern is that we live in an area that's mostly single and two-family homes. And you've created a zoning situation where you have single-family homes protected in Residence 1 and single-family homes protected in Residence 2. So you've got two zones for single-family residents. And then you've got the villages protected because you've got one, is it 3 or 4 village zones? But then you have one, or 3, then you have one zone for 2 families, 3 families, 8 families, 12 families, and then you say that you're gonna have the board just do up to 20 families, 20 units, I'm sorry, I shouldn't call it families. And then bigger projects go to the Board of Aldermen. And where now they're in, is it 4 multi-resident zone? They've all been squished into one. So we're very much concerned about how that's gonna destroy our neighborhood. And we would like you to consider taking that zone, that Residence 3, and creating a Residence 4 and a Residence 5 for your little apartments and your big apartments. Because to say the difference between a single-family home and a 3-family home, right beside it, if there's a 3-family home, then I don't know how many units you can go up to, but the calculations seem to be moving. So what we would like you to do is break the Residence 3 zone up into a couple more zones and put your apartment houses where they belong, out on the street and not back in the neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Okay, all right, one more comment right here.
Hi, this is my first ward zoning meeting, and I like it. I like what I've seen, the presentation by the city planning staff, and I think that you should have more of these once the other drafts come out. So when you get the second draft, do the 8 ward meetings again. When the final draft comes out, do the 8 ward meetings again.
Good idea.
That way you get as much public feedback as possible, and it's, it's our properties. We should have a say in what the zoning looks like for the whole city. That's it.
Thank you for the thought.
All right, where are we going here?
Here.
All right, we'll get this one and then we'll go back up here. I'm coming around.
So I just, thank you for the last speaker. I think it makes sense to look at the whole map again and think about where the apartment buildings should go, because I agree with the other person who mentioned it kind of a domino effect, every 500 feet and there goes the neighborhoods. you know, one of the things you said at the beginning was we want to keep what we love about Newton, and what we love about Newton is having these villages and neighborhoods around the villages. And, you know, I went to a meeting over a year ago, when the mayor was there, it was over in Hawthorne Park at 8 in the morning, and we're talking about, you know, how to include everyone and how to make it a citywide process, and she even mentioned, you know, Newton Center should be considered, and it doesn't seem like there are any apartment building zones that are being talked about for Newton Center. I mean, you do have that big parking lot in the middle, which is not an efficient use of space if you're talking about, you know, you want to put in affordable housing apartment buildings. I don't see why they can't be adjacent to someplace like Newton Center, which has what you need. It's got the T access, it's got the walkable village. Why can't some of those people sell their mansions and, you know, let that be transitional zoning all around Newton Center to make it for apartment buildings? Why does it have to be squished into the perimeter, which it is now, and it's totally unfair? And, you know, to the point of, you know, having it be, you know, things aren't affordable. Look, no one that I know who has kids can afford to buy here. So everyone has to drive to the 495 belt, and there's lots of nice houses out in Hollywood to buy, and it's not as convenient, and yes, the world has changed and that's sad, but we can't solve everything today. You know, we just have to make the development that happens equitable across the city, and I think that's the underlying, what you call policy issue, that transcends all of the minutia of details about, you know, the zoning, that needs to be resolved citywide with our politicians and our policymakers. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we are doing those exact things that you're talking about in terms of looking at areas where more density may be appropriate around transit. So some of the things we talked about before, where we're looking at areas and developing vision plans. So stay tuned. Okay, here we go.
One question was relating to this business with the apartment buildings and 3. Have you done modeling?
We have.
And do you find that density, I mean, what do you find with the density of apartment buildings? Does it go up, and what sort of parameters have you put in?
So we're working on that now. That meeting that James mentioned, February 25th, is going to be our build-out analysis. One of the things that we've been looking at is that 500 radius distance. Sneak peek, that might be too big. And we're also hearing, as a lot of people here tonight have said, that mechanism itself might not be the right mechanism for Newton. So we're going to pose several ideas to the city council and say, you know, this is where we started, and we want to hear from the city council what direction to take next.
So you are doing modeling though? 'Cause
We are.
It fits in, but the questions are things that needs to be modeled. The other is, I live in a place that was business zone and is now R3, and I'd like to understand the reason, because that's a transition that people haven't mentioned.
So I'm going to go back to because there's a few things to unpack there. So I'm going to go back to the Ward 1 proposed map. So we mapped to what's on the ground. So if you were a residence building in a business zone, we mapped it to a residence district as much as we could, where it made sense, where the pattern lines happen. The neighborhood general, because we haven't talked about that, and neighborhood general covers much of Adams Street.
So what color is that, Rachel?
That's that darkest brown. So the neighborhood general is a predominantly residential zone that allows for small-scale commercial uses. So Adams Street is kind of like that today. You have a fine-grained mix of these small shops.
It's really charming, I think, and it's an important part of our neighborhood.
Exactly. So we wanted to preserve that concept of these areas where you have that fine-grained mix, and they occur in places like Adams Street, but also very frequently at the edges of our village centers, where you have doctor's office next to little shop, next to house, next to two-family. And the mixing happens at a very fine-grained, small scale. So you'll see that gets applied also coming out of Newton Corner, Adams up on California Street. You'll see that in several areas.
So like my particular one has changed to R3. That's distinct from that.
Let's talk, because again, the lines, we mapped to what was on the ground.
Well, yeah. It's just a small sample.
So,
it's so,
right.
yeah.
So what we are doing though is, if people do have questions on the map, we are keeping a log. And we're going to present a second draft map with the second draft ordinance, and also that log to the city council. Say, here's what we heard. Here's where people would like to see some small shifts. especially those small shift things. The bigger questions, we need to wrestle those with Flock.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate what you said, because I think there's a lot of fear because a lot of this is complex. Zoning is not simple. And I think, one, I liked the gentleman's idea of coming back, especially here, because, and where R3s are, because that certainly has raised concerns for people, to show what actually can be, with whatever you come up with for configuration, this one, or whatever you do, so they understand in my neighborhood what it could be. And also, you're going to have office hours, and I would encourage people, walk down, ride down to City Hall, whatever, and say, well, given my street, given your modeling, given your patterning, kind of what does this mean? Because this is too kind of up here for people, and it's, zoning took me 16 years to understand it. So I really would encourage on both sides to help people understand. And then, will the concerns still be there? I have no idea, but at least they will be better educated.
That's a good comment.
Up here and then there.
First I heard that there's a trade-off between 100% affordable and green. That's not a trade-off, we need both. And we shouldn't give a developer the choice. I think we should drive towards both.
That's an interesting note. Thank you.
I want to encourage more meetings. I don't know how many people here in 1, 2, or south of the Turnpike, but there was no information in my neighborhood about this meeting.
What ward are you in?
I'm in Ward 1. I'm on the edge of it, on Lewis Street, and and I found it hard to find the information. You go to the city website, it's not obvious. It says city council, mayor. Compared to what you've done, particularly with Hello Washington Street, this has been a 0, and it's been much more complicated. But the question I would like to ask, and I'm going into an R3 where there's only single family, primarily small single family, some 2 family. I'm amazed nobody's talking about tear downs, because it would seem that R3 is an invitation for more tear downs. There's a lot of tear downs down on Princeton and Eastside Parkway. People are quite upset.
Yep.
And I think that when you're making changes, it would seem to be unfortunate to encourage tear downs because they are coming in very expensive. When I moved here 51 years ago, all those 2 families were homeowners on 1 floor and renters on the 2nd. They had a chance to move to the city. Most of them have now been condoized, at least in my neighborhood. But I think you've got to look at that, how do we disincentivize tear down?
Yeah, thank you for that comment. That's really an important part of this overall effort, this idea of.
It seems like it's going the wrong way.
Well, but, so part of our build-out analysis that we're doing is a tear-down analysis to compare under the existing ordinance, where we are seeing a lot of tear-downs, and the first draft ordinance. What's the rate of tear-downs between the two? And we're comparing those, and as we've said many times, this is the first draft. That's one of the key data points that I'm sure our council is going to be using in terms of identifying what changes we make to the ordinance going forward. The other thing I'd say that's really important is a lot of the tear downs we're seeing up in this part of the city are the 2 families, where someone tears down a 2-family and replaces it with a very, very large pair of 2 families, right?
Side by side.
Side by side, right? Sell for huge sums of money. I encourage you to take a look at the 2-family building type that we've included in this ordinance, which is significantly smaller than what's allowed today. That big 2-family that we showed a picture of, that was a by right project under our existing zoning ordinance, would not be allowed. You would
in R3?
It's in an MR district today in West Newton.
But that district right now, there's an example, where Lewis Street there are 2 families and 1 family, some on one side, two on the other. If it goes to R3, you're not gonna have smaller 2 families allowed than now, right?
No, but the ordinance as it's written, yes, those 2 families are smaller than what we allow today in the ordinance.
But it's 6,000 square feet is allowed today by right in the MR, in R3.
So what we're seeing on the north side, including that example we showed with that tail lot, those units are typically 4,000 square feet each. So it is smaller. It's not a lot. It's, it's a little bit of a difference, and that's, we're calibrating all of those numbers. Those footprint numbers are gonna be a big part of that conversation about the build-out, is are those numbers, where do they need to shift to really deal with that whole tear-down vulnerability?
Thank you. I was hoping you could hypothesize, if we do not redesign our zoning, what the future of the city would be like. What would be the consequences of not doing zoning redesign?
So, let's go back to this map. Is this working? Okay. So,
City Councilor Marie.
what can happen in this map right now? So, this is our current zoning ordinance. This is what can happen today. Every house in the brown areas could be a two-family if they wanted to be, right now. All of the brown areas, the darker brown areas, could all be two-family homes instantly. We know that's not how those neighborhoods are. Those neighborhoods have a mix of ones, twos, and sometimes threes and more. What we're seeing in the world is that there's multiple factors at play. There's the market needs change. Ground floor master bedrooms are a huge point of conversation that weren't a part of conversations 15, 20 years ago, but we have demographic changes that say ground floor master bedrooms are really important. So market needs change. Then you've got to have a willing seller. Who's willing to sell their property for something to change? Not everybody's willing to sell. Not everyone wants their house to become something else that it's not already today. So those two factors have to come together, and then you have zoning, which is what can you actually do. So the zoning that's under here today, again, the vast majority of those darker areas could all be two-family by right. The yellow areas, those single-family areas, typically allow a much larger single-family home that might be on the lot. We're seeing that those areas are where we do have some teardowns too. Teardowns are occurring both in the multifamily districts and in the single-family districts. And that's typically because the zoning ordinance that we have today allows for much larger homes than we actually have in Newton. And that's part of this calibration to actual buildings in Newton with the pattern book, is to look at what do we really have, what is our actual building stock, and not just the building envelope that was allowed in 1953.
I was just to add, and I think the point you were making there is that these areas of the city where we see a mixture of singles and twos have allowed two families by right for over 100 years. Before we had zoning, when we had the first zoning ordinance, and all the way up through today, those two families have been allowed by right. But yet they're still a mix of singles and twos. So we know that zoning by itself is not destiny. And that change happens over very long periods of time because there's all these factors that have to line up in order for a building, an individual building, to actually flip over to something different. So the point, though, your question about the difference between the city under our proposed ordinance or under the first draft ordinance, which, I think it's really important for us to remember that it's a first draft and we're going to spend a lot more time. So let's talk about what we're aiming for. We're aiming for the second or third draft to reduce the number of teardowns that we see around the city, right? That's something we've heard from every single councilor at one point or another and from a large number of the community. We're aiming for something that is addresses to a much greater extent the environmental issues that we're talking about in the city. We are looking at how do we create ways to enhance housing diversity within the context of the existing city and within the patterns of development within the existing city. But clearly, from the conversation we've had here today, there's going to be a lot more conversations about that with the city council and how that's reflected across the entire city. We're looking at a more modern ordinance that addresses issues of parking and transportation in a much more modern way than our current ordinance does, where our parking standards reflect 1941, I believe, 1953 at best, standards for parking. So there's a lot of things in our current ordinance that just have been neglected for decades and decades, and this effort is about addressing those issues. So.
Hi, I just have a couple of quick questions. The first is, can you point us to the spot on your website where you can show us the evidence that the residents of Newton gave their permission or assented or said that they wanted zoning for increased density across the city? Can you show us where that is when you poll the people of Newton to find out if they wanted that?
So our job as staff, I can answer that one. is to take input, to apply some technical knowledge, and to present a draft, and get further input, and then have the city council react to it, and then make adjustments. That's the way the process works.
I have two quick questions.
Okay.
So you don't have that evidence. My second question is, have you published anywhere all of the many criticisms of the consultant's pattern book and the many inaccuracies of the mapping on the, that I'm trying to understand the rationale behind zoning reform, because my understanding about zoning is when you purchase a property, you purchase the zoning that comes with it, and that zoning is your guarantee that your property won't change radically in value and that your quality of life won't change radically. Zoning reform, as I understand it, is about increasing affordability, diversity, and housing choices. It's about getting rid of nonconformity, and it's about, preventing tear downs. But it seems like this proposal incentivizes tear downs. Yes, I'm getting to the question.
Okay, good.
It incentivizes tear downs. And it won't actually make housing more affordable, because as you upzone all these properties, you put property speculation pressure on them. The valuations will go up, the taxes will go up, even people who don't want to sell will be forced to sell because they won't be able to afford the higher taxes with increased assessments. I mean, you're basically pushing out people who can't afford the tax increases that will be coming their way. It's great if you want to sell out, but if you want to stay here, you may be pushed out.
So I'll answer the last part of that first, which is the relationship between tax assessment and zoning, I think. So tax assessment is based on what's actually on the ground. It's not based on your zoning. So if you have a residence in a business district, you actually pay residential tax rate. That's what the assessor's department has explained to us. We're not involved in this stuff normally, but that's the explanation we've gotten, is that they're looking at what's on the ground. If it's a residence, they're basing it on the residential district tax rate. If it's a business, they're giving it a business tax rate. Similarly, for multi-unit versus single unit, they're looking at it, again, what's on the ground. Is it a 1-unit building, or is it a 2-unit building, or is it a 3-unit building? And they have their tax rates based on what's real.
Assessments change as the properties around are sold. So as property speculators buy up 2-family houses, the surrounding properties will go up in value.
Got a question over here. How are we doing time-wise? Everybody hanging in there?
Rachel,
Yep.
could you point them to the 2011 zoning reform document, which did give you your marching orders?
Yes, so the zoning reform group was a group established in 2011, consisted of a wide variety of perspectives. Some of our counselors served on it at that time.
A lot of developers and architects.
This is the themes of that report. That report is on the city's zoning redesign website, which is newtonma.gov/zoning redesign. I'll put that slide up as well.
Okay, we got a question over here.
So I have a couple of comments. I noticed that you did not include any increase in the demolition delay from 1 year to a year and a half. I notice you have not increased the recommendation for increasing the amount of time one has to wait before tearing down a house and building a new house from 1 year to 1.5 or to 2 years to discourage tear downs and encourage perhaps more rehabilitation.
That's a policy, not a zoning, I think.
So to answer that, there's the zoning ordinance, which is one chapter of the city's city's ordinances. So chapter 30 is the zoning ordinance. There's 29 before that and a few after. And the demolition delay actually doesn't live within zoning. It's a separate ordinance.
Well, it's something that should be included in this calculation. It's something to be recommended if your desire is to retain the existing housing stock rather than add demolitions. Similarly, when you tear down a house and you have an old lot, you're allowed to build it to the old lot restrictions, but you're creating a new situation. You should not be allowed to build as large a house as the 1953 zoning allows. You have a new situation, which should require a smaller house, a smaller building footprint, more distance in the side setbacks, and more distance from the street. That's not a calculation at all. So I have one other question here. I noticed on the chart for residence 3, I noticed for the lot for residence 3, the lot coverage is 60%. What is the current lot coverage allowed for multi-residence 1? 60% is twice what it is for residence 2, and twice what it is for residence 1, which seems to me to allow a much larger footprint on the lot, much more profit motive for the developer to come into the neighborhood and build a very large dwelling.
So I can answer that last one quickly, I think. So lot coverage has a different definition in the first draft ordinance than it does in the current ordinance. In the current ordinance, if you look for the line lot coverage in the current ordinance, there's a number somewhere around 30% most of the time. And that number is just the building. That's all that number is covering. The definition that we have in the first draft ordinance is it's all in. It's the garage, it's the driveway, it's the deck, it's the patio, it's the swimming pool, it's everything that's built. So the number is higher, yes, but it's also including a lot more.
So that makes this document even more incomprehensible. I do notice that there's twice the lot coverage for an MR, for a residence three than it is for two. No matter what it is, it's 35% for residence two, and a multi-residence difference is 60%. It seems to me you're encouraging overdevelopment in the multi-residence areas, and you're increasing the size of them by your analysis of how to make everything conform.
So on that point as well, so lot coverage, as we've explained with some of the, James was explaining on that nonconformity, where we were aiming, the number for lot coverage is also one of those things that came out of our conformity test. So we looked at lot coverage in each of the districts and said, okay, how do we get to 80%? What's the number that you would need to get to 80% conforming? So 60% somewhere in that 75 to 80% conforming. There are a lot of lots in the R3 that are actually at 85, 90, 100%.
Yes, they built in 1895 and they're on 4,000 feet of land. Why is that desirable?
All right, so first off, thank you for the comment. That's why we're here, right, to receive these comments. But second, it's understanding the nuance, and I think you do, of what it means if a property remains non-conforming. If we bring a property into conformance, it means that they can't expand that footprint any further. Once you're conforming, you have to follow the rules. But if you're non-conforming, so if you come in, if we reduce it down to 40% lot coverage, and now we've increased the non-conformity substantially, now you have to come in and get a permit to change, to make any change to the property, so that's the burden on the homeowner. But beyond that, the neighborhood now has no predictability as to what can happen, because you can expand, with a permit, you can expand that nonconformity and continue to expand that nonconformity.
Well, I can understand it, but I believe that the terminology and the organization and presentation is exceedingly complex.
Do we have any new questioners, petitioners here? I think we got one in the back. Julia, do you have your hand up, or you?
Yeah, I do have my hand
I'll come
up.
back to you.
And we are past time, so if you do need to go, we completely understand.
Yeah, I think we're gonna take two more questions. I saw some repeat questions, but I think we'll hold those.
We'll still be here, but.
So I'd like to talk about cars. New ordinance talks about all on cars. To build a two-family unit like that, we need 2 parking stalls per unit. The new ordinance does not require any space at all for cars. I hope you factor that into your build out analysis. And secondly, can someone tell me if car usage, like taxing the cars, is going up or down in the city?
Do you get that question?
So the question had 2 parts. Car usage, is it up or down? And car taxes, are they up or down?
No, I think the first question had to do with the parking spaces for 2 unit. The second question is car usage going up or down in the city?
Okay. So the parking requirement. We are looking at a parking requirement that is, where we aren't requiring parking spaces for 1 and 2 unit homes. That does not mean we expect all homes to have no parking. We thoroughly anticipate that most homes are still going to have parking. What we're looking at though with that is that if you are the homeowner who has a house and a garage and driveway that could accommodate 2, 3 cars, and you buy that house and you plan on not owning a car and would instead like to put that space to garden, that you ought to have the flexibility to remove the parking space, have it as garden, and let it be the next homeowner's decision as to whether or not it should be driveway.
So, do we have a second? James, did we look at car registration trends in the city? I don't know if we nailed that down yet.
Car registration, what data I've seen is it's essentially flatline.
Okay. All right, we got one more question here, and then Julia will wrap it up. just like she did last time, so good timing, Julia.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of community diversity and inclusive. But have we studied about the neighborhoods, like I couldn't, like around us to see where there is zoning, what happens to the area? Like I can pick an example, like the Potter Square is one of them. The zoning eventually has become a hub that it's so expensive, it's only affordable for certain people. Now I could see this R3 could be a next hub for the next big place, and it start out nice to be initially it's affordable, but eventually will not affordable anymore after a couple of 5 years, and then it will drive everyone else because the developer will come in and buy everyone. So if you have studied that, please show the numbers on all the neighborhoods that you have studied and what have this price up and down, and how have they done compared to what we are right now.
So February 25th is that build out analysis. We aren't done yet, which is why we don't have anything right now. We're still in the works, but we are in the process of studying these questions. And the big one that I think gets to your question is this tear down vulnerability, which is how does the zoning allow so much more that we increase the vulnerability for a tear down to happen? So we are looking at that issue very seriously.
Okay, we're gonna be around, we'll have one more question, but we're not going anywhere, so.
Right, I think you already know that the numbers in the thing don't reduce tear down vulnerability, but I'd like to follow up on the parking. I'm glad you brought that up because I don't think enough attention has been paid to the relationship between parking demand and this pressure to get rid of the winter parking ban or reduce the winter parking ban or make it more liberal, because, I mean, especially in this part of the city, I know there's not much R1 and R2 where you've eliminated the minimum parking requirement, but in R3 where you're only requiring one parking space per unit, we know that there's a lot of two-income families. People will still want to own two cars even if they don't use them all the time, and I believe Susan could probably confirm this or not. I believe the impetus for the recent docket item to experiment with getting rid of the winter parking ban in certain streets and more too came from somebody that bought a house with no parking and came to you and said, gosh, I have no parking in the winter. So I think we can, the more units we have, the more people we're going to have coming in with that request, and that'll build on the pressure to get rid of the winter parking ban, and I just can't imagine what these streets are going to look like.
Thank you for the comment.
Okay, all right. So thank you all for coming tonight. Appreciate it. Tariq has his way. We'll be around a lot more often. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, now how do I stop this? Let's see here. All right, so let's see. Ooh, I gotta stop this.